My name is Dolores Kepco. I was 37 years old at the time of the 1969 flood. I lived on Riverside Drive. I don't remember the address now because I live on Riverside Drive right now, but I know that address. And I'll start reading now, okay? 1969 flood. The day before, July 4th, we had a family picnic. I went to bed while the others played poker. Then when they finally quit and walked to their cars, the water was covering their shoes. That night it was hard to sleep because of the thunder and lightning. It was incessant. The thunder and lightning continued all night long. I have never experienced that ever before or after. The next day, Ed and Frank Lucca were standing in water below their knees and kept saying it's going to crest. Then Marge and Frank Lucca came to our cottage, which was next door, and we had our small pram tied there. And Ed then rowed each one of us next door to the neighbor's cottage because they had a second floor. The river was flowing fast, so Ed had to row the boat out, then in to the cottage next door. Before we did that, I remember standing on our back porch, facing the river, while the water kept rising. It was up to almost our waist, and our phone kept ringing, and I was afraid to answer it because of electricity or whatever. As we entered the house next door, I saw a large hutch floating on its back in their living room. Sorry, going back to standing on our porch, I watched a lot of stuff floating by, like picnic tables, campers, cars. When we went into Bob Bulan's house, the living room had about 4 feet of water in it. We went upstairs and continually watched the water out the window. We were in a bedroom that had rolls of carpet in it. I had my French poodle with us, and she pooped 2 little sausages on the rolled up carpet. I never apologized. Sorry. Then a boat came to pick us up. We came downstairs, and I had to put my head under the water to get to the boat because the door frame was underwater. The boat drove us across the river to West River Road. We sat on the lawn of someone's house. They also let us use their phone, and I called my sister to pick us up. She and her husband had a difficult time reaching us because many of the roads were washed out. Frank and Marge were with us and came with us to our home in Lorraine. They called their son Chaz to come pick them up and take them to their home in Cleveland. When we went back after water receded, the smell of the valley was very horrendous. As you were approaching the valley, the smell hit you. Everything in the valley was the same color. It was like someone spray painted the entire area muddy brown. The trees, cottages, ground, all exactly the same color. We lost our car, truck, boat, and cottage. 8 months later, we bought my nephew's place on Riverside Drive. We now live on Riverside Drive year-round.
Hello, my name is Frank Lucca. I'm a current resident of the city of Vermilion. I was about 23 and a half years old at the time of the '69 flood. At the time, I lived with my parents in Cleveland, Ohio. And the story I'm about to relate is my brother's story. My brother Chaz Lucca, who was 19 at the time. And presently he lives in Morrow Plantation, Maine. He has a bed and breakfast called Kutcher Lodge up in that area. On the night of Friday, July 4th, 1969, I was playing in a band at a tavern in Cleveland, Ohio. Before cell phones and the internet, accurate news didn't travel like it does today. Unaware at the time of the extent of the disaster, I remember getting a phone call from someone the next morning that the Vermilion River Valley had flash flooded, which is extremely unusual for the summer, where my parents had been staying at their Riverside Drive cottage, 1059. I drove out there in my new red Chevelle convertible to find them. I got to the top of the hill on Vermilion Road and looked down into the valley and saw that only the top 2 or 3 feet of the peak of the roof of the Riverside Drive cottage was visible above the floodwaters. A lot of cars were parked along the road with people looking down at the fast-moving floodwaters. Someone there told me that all the people that had been down in the valley had been taken to a shelter in Vermilion. So I drove across Liberty Avenue Bridge into town and arrived at the shelter. The Red Cross was there, but not my parents. After another phone call, I learned that they had been actually taken to their good friends Eddie and Dolores Kepco's home in Lorain, Ohio. Trying to drive back out of town, I found that Liberty Avenue Bridge was now closed to all traffic. I was on the wrong side of the river and needed to get back, so I started driving south to find a way to cross over the river valley. I got as far as the Gore Orphanage Road Bridge and decided to cross there. The raging floodwaters were going over the roadway and the deck of the bridge. I had no idea how deep that water was, but being a brave 19-year-old guy, I took my car and sent it across the valley. Only by the grace of God did my Chevelle Malibu and I make it to the other side. My adrenaline was pumping and I was greeted in Lorain by a policeman who pulled me over for going 70 in the 35 zone. I told him I was trying to find my parents, but that didn't matter. He wrote me a ticket anyway. I did find them safe and sound at their friend's home. Their car, along with many others in the valley, had all been submerged. It was a 68 red Mercury Park Lane Ford hardtop, which I just blue coral waxed for my dad's birthday, which was June 29th. My parents' cottage was spared, unlike many others that floated off their foundations. One was even blocking the roadway. Afterwards, we had to shovel river mud out of the front door of the cottage. Everything inside the cottage was trashed, including my grandparents' antique Kimball player piano that had made it all the way from Red Lodge, Montana, but it didn't make it through the Vermilion flood. There was a small hole in the kitchen windows, and the front half of a fish was looking into the kitchen, and the rear end was still outside the window. We needed a little humor at that time. Later on, I drove back to the spot where I had driven through the floodwaters, only to find that the road was completely washed away. I knew I would have been the last car ever at that time to drive on that road. This concludes the story.
Hi, my name is Eileen Beulah, and I was 23 years old at the time of the 1969 flood, and I lived at 1000 Riverside Drive. And it was on a Friday, July 4th, 1969. Just like a lot of places along the river, Riverside Drive had all kinds of activities and parties going on. Riverside Drive at that time was mostly cottages, and there were probably about 40 cottages on that street. My husband and I built a house there in 1969 and had one child, Rich, who was 1 year old. We were one of the few people that lived there year-round. On that Friday evening, the water began to come up on the street. There were also really bad storms. We had friends staying for the weekend, my sister and brother-in-law, and another couple, Francie and George. When the water began to come up on Friday, George insisted on leaving and going home to Cleveland. We all told him he had nothing to worry about. It never flooded in July. Well, we were wrong. By Saturday morning, the water began to really rise and eventually came into our house. A couple of the owners of cottages came to our house because our living area was on the second floor. We watched the campers come down the river and watched the house next door move off its foundation. Evelyn Zabel, one of our neighbors who was really worried, got the rosary out and started to pray for a boat to come and rescue us. Finally, a boat came. She was the first one at the door, and she said, "I can't go in that boat. I need a bigger boat." So he left. We waited at least an hour longer, and then finally another boat came. They took the women and children only, and our neighbor's son, Mark, his gerbil. We had to leave our dog that floated on the bed for 3 days at home. He did survive the flood, but was never the same. I remember the water was about up to our electrical wires when we left. We had to put our head down to not hit the wires. They took us to the bottom of Nautical Drive Hill by Valley Harbor Marina, which was completely underwater, and dropped us off. So now what do? There was a woman on the top of the hill. I don't know who she was, but she was having a graduation party that evening and had all kinds of picnic tables set up in her garage, and she opened it up so we would have a place to sit down. After a while, someone came and gave us a ride to the other side of the river, where the men went. I can't remember her name. All I know is that we had to go around to State Route 113 to get across. There was no highway. Somehow we all got together, and Evelyn's sister came and got us, and we stayed there that night. The next day, my brother picked myself and Rich up, and we went to Cleveland and stayed with my parents. Dick stayed behind to begin the cleanup that took a long time. Our house ended up having more than 3 feet of water on the 3rd floor. And of course, everything had to be thrown out. The Salvation Army was wonderful, just giving us vouchers for cleaning supplies. The Red Cross said they would help us, but we had to come to Sandusky to fill out forms. That was difficult to do, since we did not have a car, nor did anybody else we know have a car at the time. But we did make it up there, and they said we didn't qualify because my husband had a job. There were many, many wonderful people that gave us furniture, a crib for Rich, and really helped us. One person gave us a TV, and when I turned it on, it was Neil Armstrong walking on the moon. I was sitting on a crib mattress on the floor and really wondered how could I not have known or paid attention to that. There are a lot more stories about the flood, and I'm sure you're going to hear them, and I hope you enjoy them all. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sarah Shahi. I was 20 years old at the time of the 1969 flood. At that point in time, I was summering at Linwood Park, but my winter home was Lakewood, Ohio. The day of 4th of July, 1969, my family, my parents, and a friend of mine from Shaker Heights who had never been to Vermilion before, and I celebrated 4th of July at Linwood. Bright sunny day, cookout, and that evening, when the rain started, we were playing bridge on our front porch. And thunder and lightning came. My poor friend from Shaker Heights was absolutely terrified. The next morning, we decided that it might be appropriate for her parents to pick her up and take her back to Shaker Heights because she was shaking in her boots. We knew that there was trouble on hand because we could see the brown water coming out of the mouth of the river, and there was an awful lot of debris coming down. In addition to that, more debris than we were used to seeing. So we were prepared to hunker down. My father got a phone call that Lakewood Park had been hit pretty badly with a mini tornado that had come through on the 4th during the fireworks. And he advised us girls, my mother and me, to stay at Linwood. He was going to drive back to Lakewood to stay at the house because there were trees down, and his neighbor had called, our neighbor had called and said that they felt that the looters were coming in. He parked on Clifton Boulevard, walked a mile into our permanent home. The lights were out, and yes, the looters had come in. So he stayed at that house with Lakewood police around. My mother and I continued to stay at Linwood. The following morning, I woke up to go to the beach, go to the beach. The boats are coming out of the mouth of the river. I threw my clothes on, went down to the beach, and I have never, ever seen anything like it. There must have been 200 boats floating towards the Linwood beach. Some of them had already been pushed onto the beach, and the looters had already come. It was daybreak, and it was a horrific, just a horrific sign of chaos. That night, the National Guard came in, and the helicopters came in to rescue the people in the lagoons. My father, who was the president of the Linwood Park Company at that time, closed the gate. That's the first time and only time the gate at Linwood was secured. People at Linwood could only come in if they were residents. Don Wilson was our superintendent at that point in time, and residents had to show their ID, and they were let in, only residents. I live very close to Portage Drive, and I can still see the National Guard walking up and down on our side of the fence with guns in hand, machine guns, or maybe not machine guns, but maybe they were rifles, walking up and down, securing our gate on our fence on our side. And that's pretty much the memories that I have. Again, Linwood had never been locked down. I'd never seen as many boats as I had on our beach, and it was a horrific sight. And that's my story of the July 4th flood. Another memory I have was the force of the river did not flow all the way through to the pier. It broke through the end of Portage between the Linwood line and the clubhouse in the lagoons. It was, if you look at an old map, you'll see that was the natural flow of the Vermilion River. It broke through where the Corrigans had built a house for their parents, where Portage bends, and you could see boats coming through that gush of water. So in addition to the flow between the piers, the river had followed its old path between Linwood and the lagoons. The other memory I have was 2 or 3 days later, the National Guard was still about, and we started to hear helicopters at night, and we couldn't figure it out, but what we figured out was that the lagoons residents were told to evacuate, which many of them did. However, there were some lone rangers who would not leave their boats, so they stayed with their boats, and then they decided that maybe they should evacuate. So the owners of the boats had to be evacuated by helicopter, and we could see the baskets coming down with the lights from the helicopters and pulling people off their boats. And those are several other memories that I had. It was really a very unnerving experience, and those pictures are still quite vivid in my head. So that's my story of the 1969 flood.
My name is Marlene Feldkamp, and I was 31 years old at the time of the 1969 flood. I lived at Nokomis. No, I'll take that back. Alberta Beach, 308 Erie Road, with my husband and our 2 children, Pete and Tara. They were 5 and 3. We had planned to leave on our vacation to the east up in the Smoky Mountains for a camping trip. And we had borrowed our mom and dad's tent camper. So we took it and we went down to Mill Hollow Park to camp out that night before we started on our trip, and had a very good time. It was lovely, warm, nice, wasn't raining, and then it was dark, and so we got in bed, and in the middle of the night, David said, "Marlene, did you hear something?" And I said, "Yes, I thought I heard some yelling." And he said, "Wait a minute, let's listen." And I said, "They're saying, get out of here." And I said, "Get out of here." And he says, "Uh-oh, something's wrong." So we got up, opened the camper door, and it stepped out down to the ground because it was a tent camper. And it was up past my knees, but it had been very still. It just came up gradually, and we were down lower than the rest of the campers because we could go down closer to the river. The river wasn't flowing real fast yet, but it didn't take long because by the time I got our 2 children, and then we had the neighbor boy, I loaded them up into the car. Plus I was 7-8 months pregnant at the time too. And we had 2 cars, so I got in the one and tried to get off back to the house, and I had to go up the opposite way, south, up to Mason Road and then over, and he was able, by the time he got the camper out, it had water up into the inside, and he got it hooked up and was able to pull it up from where it was, just in a matter of probably 15-20 minutes. It had just come up that fast all of a sudden, and he got the camper back home. There were a lot of other ones, and the reason I couldn't get up the way to our house was because there were big campers, and they were kind of caught on the, stopped on the hill going up to go down East River Road, as we know it, Vermilion Road now. So, but it was quite exciting. We didn't have any problem over where we live, but that day and the day before, when it started to come up, David and I went down to help his mom and dad because they had just opened up the dockside barbecue at Rom's, just where the Dairy Queen, behind the Dairy Queen, they use it as a storeroom now, but that was where we had barbecue beef sandwiches and pork, and we had chicken, and had salads and stuff he started it mainly to on the weekends to help out so that the people who had boats were able to come and have something to eat. Didn't have to rely, that was an extra place when they came in and things. But we had all this new equipment and things in there, and we got most of the stuff up higher, but we didn't think it was going to come that fast. And it just kept coming and coming, and so we lost quite a few things of the equipment that we couldn't get out in time. And fortunately, we didn't have our boat at the docks like the rest. But David and he had his movie camera, so he took some movies. So I think we have a 3-minute reel along the river and things. But we had about 25, maybe 50, I think it was 25 or 50 slides that shows down at Rumps, and how the boats were on top of cars. We watched from up above how it swelled up where you couldn't get across from where Huggies is today. And then when we were on the actual bridge, we were able to get the pictures of McCarvey's and how it got knocked down. And then I'm sure on this one that I haven't seen that there has pictures of the campers and boats smashing into the bridge from the river. And the one thing that I did have, I hadn't heard too much about, but there was so much water that it went down the lagoons, down the road next to the Linwood Park, and actually made a dredge right out between Linwood Park and the beach house at the lagoons, dug it in really deep into the sand and right out into the lake. And there's pictures of the debris all over the beach, the beaches all along down at Main Street and at Linwood and at the lagoons. And there were boats out on the beach too, and other ones that were out in the water just floating around. And it was quite the thing at the time.
My name is John Cook. I'm going to read the memories of my mother, Evelyn Nuggy Hayes Cook, about the flood in 1969. My mother was 45 years old at the time. She passed away in 2013. She was living at 5639 Huron Street at the time of the flood. What a night. Family camping at Mill Hollow and spending the supper hour with us, had left to go back down to their camp. The rains came and hammered unceasingly on our roof with no let up. After midnight, our doorbell kept ringing. I went down to answer it, and was family members from the Mill Hollow who said they got out and the last thing they were going to worry about was their tent and equipment. Got them all bedded down, back upstairs, trying to get some sleep in spite of the constant hammering of the rain on the roof. Our bed was in the attic at the time. Almost got back to sleep, and doorbell kept ringing again in the middle of the night. Went downstairs, and a family with 5 children asked us to put them up. They had left Cedar Point to go home to Norwalk. All roads were blocked up with water, so they couldn't get to their home. So what to do but come to Vermilion for shelter. Got them all put up for the night. In the morning, our freezer was floating in at least 4 feet of water. Water is not usable due to the contamination, so a truck with cyanide was around the corner to clear up the water situation. We couldn't go outside for a while, so we all got to know each other much better than before. Found out people in lagoons had been evacuated by helicopter up to the football field, which was next door to our church. Lots and lots of people sleeping in the pews, cots, etc. Managed to find enough food in town to cook a chicken dinner for them, with a couple of women helping out. Boy, were we busy, and did we ever fraternize. The next few days kept us busy cleaning mud out of the lagoons home, and the National Guard brought their big trucks in to clean. A few days later, the Tahitians from the boardwalk at Cedar Point spent the day with us, surrounded my neck with strings of ouchie shells, went down to the beach to survey all the flotsam floating in the water, and of course playing their ukuleles and singing all the time to the joy of the neighbors who came out to listen. They didn't think much of our water. It was nothing like the marvelous ocean they enjoyed at home in Tahiti. Spaghetti and salad and generous amounts of beer kept them going all day. They fell in love with my mother of 84 in a grass skirt we had resurrected from the basement. How she wiggled in her skirt and was so happy to be with us. Got the Tahitians back for the boardwalk production just in time, even though it had rained profusely on the way back, but we made it. A bad time for Vermilion in a way, but a lot of bonding was going on in the community, including the Reverend Rag and his wife Regina visiting from London, England, and that was a good thing going on in the community. Rags to this day have a warm spot in their hearts for Vermilion, and they are special to us all. We reunion about every 5 years with them, so the memories of the flood bring back many warm memories to many of us in Vermilion. We were in the news in parts of Europe and Asia, according to reports. Vermilion, a good place to drop anchor. And that was signed by my mother, Evelyn Cook, at the time, Huron Street in 1969. At the time she wrote that she lived on the road to happiness in 1999.
My name is Margaret, Wakefield, Worcester. I was 18 years old at the time of the 1969 flood. I lived at 5540 Huron Street. Our house was located on a point of land connected to the West Pier at the mouth of the river. The river was 50 feet from the south side of the house, and the lake and beach were directly behind the house on the north side. I lived with my parents, Ted and Margaret Ruth Wakefield, my sister Debbie, and my Cocker Spaniel, Honey. My brothers were not home that weekend. Reed was in the Army at Fort Knox, and Ted was at school at Case University. I had just graduated from high school and was enjoying the beautiful July 4th day. I remember the terrible storm that night. The constant lightning and thunder was very annoying. It was very hard to sleep. The next day, my mother took Debbie and me to Elyria Midway Mall to buy new summer clothes. I remember getting a pair of white denim pants. When we returned later in the afternoon, I laid the pants on my bed. We noticed the river was running fast and unusually high. Boats, campers, debris, a picnic table set with a cooler and plates were floating down the river. It was quite a sight. The river was slowly rising higher and higher. By early evening, the water had reached the top of the pier stones and was coming into our yard. Mom said it was time to put low-lying items higher in case the water came into the house. We pulled lower doors out and put them onto chairs and couches. Soon the water was flowing directly between our house and my Aunt Ruth Studd's house next door to the west. The river was heading straight for the lake, creating a new channel instead of doing its usual bend out through the piers. We drove one car to higher ground, and the other we just backed up to the turnaround in our driveway on the other side of the flowing water. It was close to twilight when the water suddenly started to rise even higher. The water was about 6 inches outside of our house and trickling through the doors, but only 1 or 2 inches inside. My dad said it was time to leave. We pulled the main electric breaker so we would not get shocked. Andy Sterling had come over to help us. I started to pack an overnight bag when my dog Honey jumped on my bed right on top of my new white pants, leaving muddy footprints. As we were leaving the house, a torrent of water was rushing between our house and Aunt Ruth's house. Andy Sterling, who was going to help us cross the water, stepped into the water and then disappeared. Luckily, he serviced and we pulled him out. Fortunately, a huge log had washed up on the beach that created a bridge over the rushing water. I picked up Honey in one arm and had my overnight bag in the other. We shimmied across the log to the other side. Debbie and I stayed at the Sterling house that night. My mom and dad stayed with Aunt Ruth. Later that night, my mom woke us up at the Sterling house to tell us that half our house had collapsed into the rushing water. She saw my dad's electric organ float out into the lake with many other things in the living room and garage. The next morning, the water had receded. There was a 12 to 15 foot deep gorge between our house and my Aunt Ruth's house. The only way to get to the house was via the pier stones still in place. The waters were about 4 feet on the outside of the house, but only about 12 inches inside. But what a muddy mess. It took forever to clean out the mud, and my white pants never came clean. The car in the turnaround had water in it about 2 feet high. My Aunt Ruth's house had only a little water in the basement. My mom called the Army Corps of Engineers to report that a portion of the West Pier had washed away. Each sandstone weighs 3 to 5 tons. The man answering the phone said, "Lady, you are crazy." My mom said, "Well, come out and see yourself," and she hung up. Later, after the pier was repaired, I measured the gap in the pier, and it was approximately 390 feet wide. Never underestimate the power of rushing water. We lived in half of a house for 2 years. My parents were not sure they wanted to live on the river anymore. Eventually decided to rebuild with strong concrete footers under the new portion of the house.
This is the Great Vermilion Flood of 1969, July 4th, 1969. And this is when we had about 10 inches of rain in the Vermilion River Valley. And this is down at Jevons Marina. You can see the parking lot is all flooded, and you can see boats washing out the Vermilion River there. They broke loose from their docks. And I started out the morning by trying to drive down to Schwentz's Bakery to get some baked goods, and here the river was across Liberty Avenue already. So I turned around and went back to the cottage, got the camera, there's my boat right there, the one with the green cover on it. And I got a life jacket for me and a long rope, and I went out and tied my boat up so it wouldn't get washed away. There we are looking from the railroad trestle to the Route 6 bridge. You can see how high the water there is underneath the bridge. Here's McGarvey's restaurant. That would be Don Parsons Marina. That's a shot taken of the from the Vermilion Boat Club, and the vacant lot there is where our house would have been built. There's Moe's Marine. There's a view of Liberty Avenue. This is from the Lagoons Beach. These are the boats that washed out with the river, and it was perfectly calm that morning, and we had fellows going out there, and they were pulling these boats in closer to shore and anchoring them there. And then all of a sudden the wind blew up, and most of these boats ended up on the beach. They were blown up on the beach. You can see some of them are in kind of a sinking condition there already. This is after the water started to recede. Again, this is at Jevons Marina down on Vermilion Road.
My name is Gayle Garrett Johnson, and we have a cottage in Linwood Park, and I've been there for a long time. And I was 18 years old in 1969. I had just graduated from high school out in Lake County, and my parents were already at the cottage, and we had a picnic celebration planned with neighbors and friends. And I came out, and the storm hit later on in the evening. I don't remember what time, but it was just very, very loud and very noisy. And I was just getting ready to head off to college and so on. So, and my memories of the storm when I got to the cottage, it was a real good rainstorm, thunder, lightning, all that kind of thing. And the lake was probably the roughest I have ever seen it. And I remember water just rushing out of the river from multiple directions, not just the river. The next day after the flood, which would have been July 5th, we had a power boat, and my dad and a neighbor were down in the lagoons rescuing people and their dogs and cats from second-story windows and helping them get into our boat. We would bring them around and let them off on the beach in Linwood. What else? Oh, and what they were doing is they tied, and boats came rushing out the mouth of the river, and my dad and several other boaters were out there, and they were trying to corral the boats, tie them together so they wouldn't just keep washing out. And then the winds shifted, and all the boats that had been connected went back to the west and hit the east pier, and we could just see them crush and splinter and that kind of thing.
I am Glenn Kutcher, son of Bonnie and Bill Kutcher, who owned the Brown Helm store located at the southwest corner of Baumhart and Northridge Roads. At the time of the 1969 flood, my parents were 34 years old. The memories I will read were written down for the 30th anniversary of the flood in 1999. We prepared for our first 4th of July at Brown Helm store by making sure the gas tanks were filled, plenty of picnic supplies were stocked, and had extra help on hand, but we weren't that busy. Our two youngest children, Albert and Bernice, went home with Bill's mother, Faye Vesper, who lived in Minnewaca. She took them fishing, and they watched the fireworks. On the way to the store on the morning of the 5th, one of the children spied a picnic table floating down the Vermilion River and told Grandma, "Look, there's a picnic table floating down the river." When we bought the store, the previous owner told us the basement never flooded, but when we went downstairs in the morning, there was water. Upon examination, it was discovered the water came from the water tank that had sprung a leak. Bill went to Sears at the mall to get a new tank. Upon arriving, he met this line of people who were there buying sump pumps to get the water out of their basements. In the meantime, I am at the store getting more gas customers than I can take care of when our neighbor, Jim Shoup, came to see if he could help me. The first thing I asked him to do was get the Ford tractor and move the stalled car from the intersection. After that, I gave him a quick lesson on pumping gas as there was no self-service. It was a full service. He learned quickly and was a great help to me. Bill's mother and our daughter Dorothy were in the store working. They made me a sandwich at lunchtime, and I took it to the gas pumps with me, as I had no time between customers that I could eat in the store. Bill finally arrived home and installed the water tank. More and more traffic was coming to the store. We found out why. They closed the turnpike and put the westbound traffic on Route 2, which at that time ended at Baumhart Road. Route 6 was closed, so they had to go south. North Ridge Road was closed at Mill Hollow. Route 113 and Route 20 were closed, so there was no way to go west until they opened the roads. We had cars all along Baumhart and North Ridge Roads. There was one family from Chicago who bought picnic supplies and had their picnic on our side lawn. Other people just visited and waited patiently. We had no restroom facilities except the outhouse, which no one complained about. Bill and I stayed open till 11 p.m. the night of the 5th to make sure those people who needed gas, etc., weren't stranded. We often recall how we prepared for the big day of the 4th, but it turned out the 5th was the big one. Bonnie Kutcher.
Hi, my name is Georgianne Tarrant. My maiden name was Diener, and I survived the '69 flood. I lived at the Olympic Outing Club, and I had just landed a job at McGarvey's Nautical Restaurant for the summer. I was home from Bowling Green University, and it was my first year away from home. And I anticipated making a lot of money to take with me and to help pay for college. I lived at the Olympic Club with my dad at cottage number 3, and my brother lived down there for the summer, but he went to Cleveland to work and then came out on the weekends. Well, everything was fine on that Friday night, and it was one of my first nights down on the floor at McGarvey's. His family trained their waitresses quite a bit before they allowed you to go out on the floor and serve his guests. So I had just completed about a week's worth of training where we learned how to watch the customers move, and when we saw them reaching for a cigarette, we'd get over there with our lighter and light their cigarette. We also learned how to fillet trout and present it to the customer right at the table. Well, that Friday night, all seemed well. The place was crowded. It was the beginning of the week of the 4th of July weekend, and everybody was in a jovial mood, but it was raining. I remember that we had a lot of people. Each waitress had a large group of customers. They divided the floor into sections. And the evening progressed, and I remember it raining, and you could hear the thunder, and it was lightning. And gradually, as you looked out the window, they have the big windows right over the river, the water appeared to be coming up the windows, like if you were looking at an aquarium filling up. And nobody thought anything of it. The customers were happy, the tips were good that night, and there was a band in the bar playing, and everybody was having a good time. Well, after I got off work, I went into the bar the band was playing and the customers were having a good time. And somebody came back and said, well, the parking lot is starting to fill up with water. People said, oh, well, I mean, they didn't care that much as long as they could get their cars out. So we stayed till the end of the evening, and the band played on, and the customers were happy. We didn't have any thought that any disaster was coming until the next morning. A couple of my friends from the Olympic Club, we went up to the bridge because we had heard that the water was coming up. And it must not have been coming up that much, because we took our car, went up to the bridge, and we saw trailers and boats coming down the river, picnic tables, like we all know, with the baskets and everything still on them. But then somehow I got word that there was something, that it was flooding worse at the Olympic Club. So we went back down to the cottage, and my dad was at the bottom of the hill. He was president of the club at that time, and he was frantically looking for someone to take my brother's car. And a friend of his had parked their car there and taken a boat to Put-in Bay. And he frantically was offering people huge sums of money to just tow the car up the hill. Cost was no object. Well, he was successful at getting that. And then my brother, as we recall, he had gone to Put-in Bay Friday night, and he and a friend were, he recalls that it was storming quite badly that night, and they were in the storm on the way to Put-in Bay. So they got there and waited for the storm to subside. He said the next day they had heard that Vermilion got hit, so they came back. He said the ride back was as calm as anything. There was no storm or anything. So he couldn't get his boat up the river because the water flow from the flood was so strong that you couldn't navigate up the river. So he and his friend landed their boat. They threw an anchor over at the lagoons beach. And he said that they swam to shore. I didn't realize that they had done that until just recently. They swam to shore. Well, he came down, checked on my dad, and he was happy that the two cars were saved. Well, then when he went back to look at his boat, the next day a storm had come, and most of the boats who had been anchored out in the river or out in the lake were just pushed into shore in a mangled mess. So he lost his boat, but we were happy that everybody was safe. My brother's name is Terry, and his last name is Diener. Now, our cottage, like every other cottage, had been 5 steps up. They were each on foundations, but there were only 5 steps to get into the cottage. Well, when whatever happened, the second wave of the flood came by, the water was over the roofs of the cottages. And these cottages were about 15 feet tall, like at the tip of the roof. And 4 or 5, or maybe even more, that hadn't been anchored to their foundation were lifted by the current and taken downstream and either landed in the woods behind the cottage or went down the river and were smashed, as everything else had been, by the trestles. And it was a sad, sad day, because from what I read in the newspaper since then, since they were a private club, they didn't receive the assistance from the other state agencies that had been helping further up the river. And being private like that actually caused the members to have to sink or swim. And some of the members were ready to give up, I mean, especially the ones who had lost cottages. Well, since my dad was the president, he tried to get people to carry on, tried to arrange to have cottages moved back onto their foundation. But it was a very sad day, especially since it took so long for the debris. The mess kind of just lingered there for a number of weeks. And that's why it's so important that we, the Olympic Outing Club, remember this day, because it could have ended the establishment totally if everybody had decided to give up. But luckily they didn't, and this is the 50th anniversary, and we're going to have a big party. Thank you.
My name is Jodi Imars. At the time of the flood, my maiden name was Jodi Butler. We lived at 1020 Riverside Drive at the time. That was our summer cottage. And I was 5.5 years old at the time. It's funny, people don't realize that at 5.5 years old you can remember things like it was yesterday. It still amazes me how many things are just like there's a video in my head reminding me of what happened. I remember on the night of 4th of July, we'd had a lot of storms, and we started flash flooding that night in the road, which wasn't totally unusual for really bad storms because we are close to the river. But the next morning, the water was already about 3 or 4 foot high in the street. And I remember my one uncle, who was the only one at the time with us, he had tied a rope around him. He was a very large man. He still needed to tie a rope around him because the current was so strong already. And he was going to other cottages and homes in the area and bringing people to our cottage because it was one of the few places that was built up at the time. Most of the places were ground level. Some were just sitting on cinder blocks, but ours had what we considered an above ground basement, and then the house sat up above that. My other uncle and my father were in Canada at the time on a fishing trip, so they had no idea what was happening, obviously no cell phones or anything like that. And so my mom and my aunt and myself, my cousins, and my other aunt and uncle, we had gathered at our cottage, and he was bringing some other people over. My uncle that was with my dad, he and my aunt had the cottage next door to us, and their cottage was on cinder blocks at ground level. And I remember at some point, my uncle went next door, and he and someone else, I don't remember who, brought my aunt's father, Grandpa Tim, over in a little about 14-foot car topper aluminum boat from their cottage over to ours. And shortly after that, I remember seeing the front of their cottage fall down. Evidently the cinder blocks had started coming out from underneath it. I remember my cousin screaming at the time, and that scared me more than the cottage actually. That sticks in my mind so much. And throughout the day, as the water was coming up, we were counting the steps. And each time it came up another step, people were getting a little more concerned. What's going to happen? You know, the water can't possibly get any higher. And it just kept coming up and coming up. And when it got within 2 or 3 steps of coming up inside the house, I remember my mom asking me, I'm not sure if it was just to keep my mind off things or because she really thought this would help, but she said, come in the kitchen with me and let's get everything out of the lower cabinets. So we went around and took all the pots and pans and the boxes of cereals and everything, and we put them all up on the kitchen countertop. And then we went over to the living room and we took the TV and the stereo system and we moved all of that into the bedroom, and she put it all on the top of bunk beds. And as it turned out, those were the few things that were saved. The water did end up coming up all the way over the kitchen countertops, and kind of skipping ahead a little bit, but just to give you an idea, this is the cottage, this is the lower level here, and the water was up at the time where these windows are. That was all open porch and just had the crisscross railings. The water was up over the bottoms of these windows, to give you an idea of where the water ended up at the peak of the flood after we were gone. But just before the water came up inside, it was at the last step before coming up into the cottage where we were standing. Somebody came with some about a 14 or 16 foot aluminum car topper boat, and they came up to the railing where the porch was, where we were standing, and they told the kids, myself, my brother, my cousins, to get in, and they were going to evacuate us. And I remember turning to my mom, because it was ingrained in our heads, we didn't go near the river, we didn't go near the water, and we didn't get in a boat without a life vest. And they didn't have any life jackets. And I turned to my mom and I said, "Mom, my life jacket's downstairs in the basement. It's all flooded. I can't get it." She said, "Just get in. They'll take care of you. Don't worry about it. You can break the rules this time." So they brought us around. They came around the back side, and they got us off of the porch. And they took us around to the front of the cottage, across the street to the hill between Riverside Drive and Vermilion Road. And there were firemen there with a rope with knots tied in the rope. And they were staged down the hill. And I remember trying to climb up, and it was just mud. The whole hill was just mud, and it was so hard to get a foothold. And we climbed up to Vermilion Road. And shortly thereafter, they went back and got our parents and aunts and uncles, and brought us up to the top. One of the other things I remember, there was a grill, a brick grill between my place and my aunt and uncle's on the other side of us. Theirs was the other place that was up like ours. It had the two basements with the carport in the middle. And my aunt and uncle's car was parked there. They were luckily on a trip on their boat, so they weren't there at the time. But I remember when the water got to a certain level, their car started to float, and it just kind of slowly lifted up a little and banged into the grill and stayed there. The current was very strong at the time. But anyway, there was just so many people that we didn't know where they were, what happened to them. Very concerned about how everyone was going to get out. If it took us that long, or it took them that long to get us, we were wondering what happened to everyone else, because there were so many people that were in cottages and homes that were not raised up like ours was at the time. But luckily they all did get rescued. The biggest problem was people finding other people, because some were taken over to the west side of the river, others were taken to the east side of the river. The last thing I remember of the day was after we got up on Vermilion Road and they had rescued us. There was this wonderful lady who lived in a house right across the street, and she went in the house and came out with this huge bowl of M&Ms and candy. Wonderful, wonderful lady. Just trying to make the best out of a bad situation and try to give us a little bit of normalcy to our lives at that point. And I think back to her today and just was so grateful to her, because I remember we actually was the first time that day that we laughed and had a good time. And that's my story.
I am Margaret, Wakefield, Worcester, and I will be reading the memories of the 1969 flood by Helen Toady Root. I was 41 years old at the time of the July 4th, 1969 flood. I lived at 5472 Willow Lane in Vermilion Lagoons. Our house is the last house on the street located on the bend of the river. I was living there with my husband, Robert, known as Bob, who was 46 at the time, my son, Rob, 16, and Kelly, 6. Bob and I built the house ourselves, which took 6 to 7 years. I remember the storm on Friday night. The next day is what I remember the most. The river water was higher and higher, and we thought we should not stay. We got in the car, and we were about halfway down Willow Lane, and the water was starting to come in through the car doors. We decided it was not a good idea to go further since the land is lower ahead. We backed up the car to our house. We never saw the river flood, so we did not prepare the house for the rising water. Some pumps were located in the crawl space. We saw lots of things go out of the river, boats, campers, lots of debris. We were worried that something might hit the bay window on the riverside, so we decided to go next door to George and Judy Ross' house just to the east of our house. The water was coming up and up and up. It was at windowsill height. We went upstairs in the Roth house where we stayed and waited. The telephone pole near the house was starting to bend and the electricity went on half phase. This also made our sump pumps work at half phase. We watched our house through the windows and could see our living room. No water was getting in except a very small amount around the braided rugs. It was not even an inch deep. It was dark outside about 9:30 to 10 when we heard a helicopter in the distance. We started waving a white pillowcase outside the window to get their attention. It took about 45 minutes before they came over to the Roth house. They lowered a flat wire basket with curved sides down to us. Bob caught the basket. He got a shock of electricity. I got in first and laid down on my back. Bob put Kelly on top of me. I crossed my arms around her and was lifted to the helicopter. Rob was next to leave, then Bob. I don't know how he was able to get in that basket, swinging around as it did. Each time he grabbed the basket, he was shocked. The Ross declined to leave and stayed in their house. The helicopter took us to the Congregational Church. My mom, dad, sister, and her husband waited with us at the church until the water receded and we could go back to our home. Our car was submerged in the muddy water and was a total loss. We were lucky that we did not have much damage inside. The way we built our house, it was sealed and caulked tightly. Only a dribble of water came in. That was her memories.